On September the 8th, 2019, we left LAX and spent the next 13 and a half hours covering the 7,600 miles to Tel Aviv. Then, as if we weren't tired enough, we met our leader, Father Scott Borgman, and our amazing guide to Israel, Esmer Kalmovich, and we're immediately off to Jaffa, 6 kilometers down the road. We had our first Mass in St. Peter's Church, originally built in 1654. Napoleon lived in 2 rooms which are part of a 13th century citadel located at the sacristy. So we briefly poked around Jaffa. The city is first referenced in Egyptian writings in 1440 BC and has a remarkable history encompassing everything from Alexander the Great to the Ottomans to Napoleon. St. Peter lived here during his missionary activities in the house of Simon the Tanner, now privately owned, but which we visited. After being finally allowed to rest, the next day we headed the 40 miles to Ein Kerem, an ancient village southwest of Jerusalem where tradition says John the Baptist was born. Ein Kerem today has a population of 2,000 and receives 3 million visitors a year. We toured the Church of the Visitation, where Mary stayed for 3 months with her cousin Elizabeth until Elizabeth gave birth to John the Baptist. The current 2-level churches are Franciscan and were built in 1955 to replace several earlier churches. The very first church on the site is attributed to Empress Helena, Constantine the Great's mother. Now we headed the last 7 kilometers into Jerusalem and to the Mount of Olives, the so-called Western Hill outside the walls of the old city. From the Mount of Olives, it is possible to get a view of the Temple Mount, which has been supervised by Muslims since the Islamic conquest of Jerusalem in 638. The second temple, built in 516 BC, where Jesus taught, was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, and the Muslim Dome of the Rock, which you can see today, was completed in 692 AD.
The get-up was a little more than I was expecting.
Are you guys careful of your rear here? So we pushed down the Mount of Olives to the Dominus Flevit Church, originally built by the Crusaders and later converted to a mosque during the Turkish period. Tradition says that Christ wept here for the impending destruction of Jerusalem. Now we headed further down to the Garden of Gethsemane, the location of Jesus' betrayal, and the Basilica of the Agony. While there are 4 competing locations for the Garden of Gethsemane, this is the location that has the strongest tradition. The garden and the church have been enclosed by a wall since it was purchased and donated to the Franciscans by 2 Croatians in 1681. Of course, I've got to add that in the left nave is a powerful mosaic presented to the church by Ireland. The actual church is the 3rd church in the location, the Byzantine Basilica being built in 380, the Crusader Basilica in the 12th century, and the present church, designed by noted architect Antonio Barluzzi and completed in 1924. The next day we headed the 6 miles to Bethlehem, a city of 200,000 people. It is on the West Bank and is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Crossing into Bethlehem is definitely like entering a new country, and Israeli citizens are not permitted. It's worth mentioning that in the 1950s, the Christian population of the West Bank was 50%. Now it's in the region of 2 to 5%. Our first visit was to the Chapel of the Milk Grotto, erected in 1872 and claimed as the place where the Holy Family hid from Herod's troops in the weeks following the birth and before they were able to flee to Egypt. The space contains 3 caves. Attached to the church is a monastery of the Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, who also pray non-stop for peace. Then we cross to the Church of St. Catherine, located adjacent to the Basilica of the Nativity. This, in effect, is the local Catholic Church, with a long history from which the Latin Mass is broadcast each Christmas from Bethlehem. The current church was funded by Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria in 1881. We also explored the complex of caves under the church. Now we entered the Church of the Nativity, first built by Constantine the Great in 330. It was destroyed by fire, possibly in 529, and a new basilica built by Emperor Justinian shortly after. The church has remained largely unchanged since that time. Through the good timing of Ezer, we avoided the frequent 3-hour wait to get to the birth location. Now, after an excellent lunch, we visited an extraordinary shop, Bethlehem Nativity Souvenirs, with exceptional olive wood carvings, some ranging up to $100,000 in price. Now we had a brief interlude of goat acquaintances. And finally, a visit to the chapel of the Shepherd's Field, where the angels announced the birth to the shepherds. It's thought that the shepherds herded their sheep all the way from here to the walls of Jerusalem each day, and that possibly there was a small farming village housed in the limestone caves underneath the church. As we left Bethlehem, we had another reminder of the state of affairs in today's Israel. Next day we were back in Jerusalem with our primary goal, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the church that contains the 2 holiest sites in Christendom, the location of Christ's death on the cross and the tomb where he was buried and rose from the dead.
The center of the first quarter.
Can I take a picture?
No.
No? Okay. At the entrance to the church can be seen the so-called immovable ladder, a symbol of the status quo agreement between the 6 Christian groups. The agreement stems from an Ottoman decree in 1757 and says no changes may be made without a unanimous agreement. The ladder has been in place since 1728. At Calvary itself, there are 2 side-by-side chapels, one Greek Orthodox located directly over the point of entry of the cross, the other Catholic. We had Mass at the Chapel of the Nailing of the Cross, 10 feet from where the cross stood. Just inside the entrance to the church is a flat stone, upon which Jesus' body was reputedly prepared for burial, though the present stone was added to the church during the 1810 construction. Under the main dome is the aedricule, enclosing the Holy Sepulchre. It has 2 rooms, one holding a fragment of the stone that sealed the tomb, and the other the actual tomb. As recently as 2016, the marble cladding which had protected the tomb for hundreds of years was removed, exposing the original surface. Now we walked the half-kilometre to the western wall, the closest location which Jews can get to the Temple Mount. Jews are not permitted to enter the Temple Mount, the holiest location in Judaism, because it is under Muslim control for hundreds of years. We then entered the Temple Mount through the one gate of the total of 11 gates permitted to non-Muslims. The Dome of the Rock itself is merely a shrine, whereas the Al-Aqsa Mosque, to which Muhammad was transported from Mecca, is the 3rd holiest site in Islam. Then over to the Eastern Gate, closed for the last time since 1541. This is also the gate through which Jesus rode on a donkey on Palm Sunday. Finally, we visited the Church of St. Anne, Mary's mother, located near the Lion's Gate, where a church has been present since the 5th century, and the present church is largely unchanged since 1138. The church is particularly noted for its acoustics, and Father Borgman gave us an impressive demo of that. Finally, we explored the Pool of Bethesda, adjacent to the church, at the site of 2 ancient pools and the original Byzantine church, where Jesus cured a paralyzed man. The next day, we headed the 77 miles north of Jerusalem to Caesarea, and then to a number of interesting locations in northern Israel, ending up in the Guy Beach Resort Hotel in Tiberias. On the way, we saw lots of evidence that it was election time in Israel. The Roman Caesarea of Jesus' time was largely constructed by Herod the Great around 22 BC. It had an impressive man-made harbour employing lime and volcanic ash to create 2 huge breakwaters. Later, Caesarea replaced Jerusalem as the civil and military capital of the Roman province. It appears that Pilate used Caesarea as a base, only going to Jerusalem when necessary. Amongst the entertainments offered in the amphitheatre was the mass execution of thousands of captives from the Jewish revolt of 66 AD, completed in front of thousands of spectators. Caesarea was captured by the Crusaders in 1101, during the First Crusade. The city was lost and recovered several times, finally falling to the Mamluk armies in 1265.
The Greece was the moat. Was it filled with water? I believe so.
Next, we briefly visited Carmel Mountain, notable for the formation by an unnamed hermit of the Carmelite order in 1210. Now we entered Nazareth, Mary's hometown and home to the Holy Family. With a current population of 77,000, Nazareth today is the largest city in northern Israel and is known as the Arab capital. We went directly to the Basilica of the Annunciation, the largest basilica in the Middle East. The current church was completed in 1969, following the demolition of the previous church in 1954. The lower level contains the Grotto of the Annunciation, widely believed as the remains of the childhood home of Mary. We explored the suspected location of the Holy Family's home and also St. Joseph's workplace before having Mass in a side chapel. Now we briefly visited Cana, the site of Jesus' first miracle of turning water into wine. Then, having renewed our marriage vows, and a brief skirmish in a Palestinian cake shop, we headed to our new base at Tiberias, where we dined with the cats at the Guy Beach Resort, and some of us swam in the Sea of Galilee. Next day, we did a series of visits around the Sea of Galilee. These included the sites of the Sermon on the Mount and of the feeding of the 5,000, as well as some serious eating. Our first visit was to the village of Tabgha, where 2 events are reputed to have occurred: the feeding of the multitude from 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and the apparition of Jesus to the disciples after his resurrection. We had Mass at the Church of the Primacy of St. Peter. Within the church is a rock at which Jesus is said to have fed the disciples and then instructed them to feed my sheep, commencing the miracle of the loaves and fishes. Now we visited the nearby Church of the Mount of the Beatitudes, where Jesus is said to have delivered the Sermon on the Mount in the early stages of his public ministry and to have fed the multitudes. Next we went to Capernaum, where Jesus did much of his teaching during his public ministry. We saw the remains of the synagogue where he taught, though much of what we saw was probably the 4th century synagogue that was built over the one he would have used. We also saw the memorial, the modern 1990 St. Peter's Church built over the excavated remains of what might have been Peter's home. The floor of the church has glass to allow observation of the excavations below. Now we visited the Kibbutz Ginnesar and saw the recovered boat found in 1986, dating to the time of Christ. This or a similar boat would have been used by Jesus on many occasions. Next on the itinerary was a boat trip on the Sea of Galilee. The group certainly scared the crew with the vigour with which they attacked the invitation to dance on this trip. We have you. Refreshments were essential after all that, so an excellent lunch was had in Tiberias. However, the coup de grace in the food department was given later that night in the excellent Magdalena restaurant in Magdala, a newly discovered historical location. Next morning, we left the hotel for another varied day, including a 75-kilometer drive to Caesarea Philippi, located in the Golan Heights, close to both the Lebanese and Syrian borders. First, we headed the short distance to Magdala for Mass. Excavations in 2006 and 2009 found an ancient settlement. Later excavations located the oldest known synagogue in Galilee and the Magdala stone, the oldest menorah outside of Jerusalem. It's also widely assumed that Mary Magdalene was from Magdala.
In an area which was Syrian minefield to prevent us from arriving here.
Caesarea Philippi has a lengthy history from the time of Alexander the Great, ultimately serving as capital of the Golan. The ruins contain remnants of shrines to various gods, particularly Pan, the Greek god of desolate places. Here Jesus gave Peter the assignment to lead his church. Now we come to the most important feature of the day, rafting on the River Jordan.
Guys!
Oh, we got it! Oh! Yeah.
Give him a paddle.
I should declare up front that I was privileged to be a member of what was clearly the best team, who would have won had we not been held back by other teams which adopted illegal tactics to hold us back. Then, for most of us, a return to Magdalena and some dancing displays wrapped up the day. Next day we headed south to Qasr el Yahud, where John the Baptist baptized Jesus in the Jordan River. We had Mass there, then proceeded to Jericho and saw the Mount of Temptation. Then we completed the 210 kilometers to Herod's Dead Sea Hotel for a swim in the Dead Sea. We crossed into a sliver of Jordan, now possible because of the 1992 peace agreement, and got to the river.
You really have to cross.
Wow.
In a minute we'll cross really again. You see, we're inside no man's land, you see it? Look on the right, see the bunker on the right? Protecting the wall. So here you don't get off the road, okay?
The area is still heavily mined and one doesn't want to get off the approved paths. So we had Mass overlooking the Jordan River.
Randy.
Now it was back to the bus and off to Jericho, the oldest city in the world, being 11,000 years old. It has a population of 18,000. It is also the lowest city in the world, being at a height of 846 feet below sea level. The city was controlled by Jordan until 1967 and thereafter by Israel, though administrative control was given to the Palestinian Authority in 1994. Tradition says that the original 6th century Greek Orthodox monastery on the Mount of Temptation was directly built over the cave where Jesus spent 40 days and nights. By the way, we had people who succumbed to the temptation to ride a camel. Anyway, being in Jericho, we had a not-so-quick Italian lunch, and soon we're looking at the Dead Sea.
In other words, the water are saturated and they cannot dissolve any more salt. Before they're running away, open quickly. They're running away. Let's open. Those who want to come.
A couple of nuggets. The Dead Sea and its shores are the lowest point on Earth, 1,412 feet below sea level. The sea itself is almost 1,000 feet deep. Its saltiness is almost 10 times normal seawater. The Dead Sea is receding very quickly as a result of Jordan River diversions upstream. However, plans are being implemented to stop this decline. Next morning we headed to Masada, a mere 20 kilometers. A fortress is believed to have existed there since 200 BC, and it's said that Herod took refuge there in 42 BC when the Parthians captured Jerusalem. Realizing the strategic importance of the place, he reinforced it with surrounding walls and built a palace there in 3 phases, commencing in 37 BC. It's understood it was intended as an ultimate refuge for the king. Masada is ultimately famous as the place where, in 73 AD, 960 Jew rebels of a splinter group called the Sicarii committed suicide after almost a year of siege during the First Jewish Rebellion of 70 AD. The Sicarii had occupied the fort since 66 AD. After that, it disappeared from human awareness, though a Byzantine church was built there in the 5th century. An American excavation in 1838 rediscovered the site, and another key excavation occurred in 1959. Incidentally, it is possible to climb up either the Roman attack ramp or the winding path if one feels so inclined. Tricky to do so in the sometimes 110-degree temperature. So we had lunch in the Masada Center and were on the bus for the 58-mile drive to Jerusalem. On the way we passed the caves where the Dead Sea Scrolls, dating from 300 BC, were discovered in 1948.
So those are the first caves in which the scrolls were discovered.
In Jerusalem we visited the Centacle, traditionally assumed as the site of the Last Supper. The location, situated over the tomb of King David, is uncertain and various studies propose alternative locations. The current building's origin is also uncertain, as it contains elements from various time periods. Then we crossed to the Basilica of the Assumption, also known as the Dormition Abbey, which tradition says is the spot where Mary fell asleep, or at least ended her worldly life, and was assumed into heaven. Incidentally, the site for this church was presented by Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1900. On the walk to our final Mass on Mount Zion, we passed Caiaphas' house, where Jesus was interned.
Peace and salvation of all. Be pleased to confirm in faith and charity your pilgrim church on earth.
On our final night, it was time for a farewell to our two outstanding leaders on an epic trip.
Just a little bit too early.